Okay. Shalom. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is one of the biggest groups we've had in a while. Which isn't saying a lot, I know, but we'll take it. Okay. The one time I actually remembered to bring my coat to be in this room, and the warm's it's actually...
It's warm.
After 11 years here, they figured out how to make it not frigid. So, okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Today, we're going to talk a lot about Iran. And by the time we're done, you'll probably say, it's enough. All right, I know everything I need to know about Iran, and I'm good for a while. But I'm going to start 2,600 years ago and go up through today. So we're going to cover a lot of material, but some of those years, not much happened. So we don't have to go through every single day of all 2,600 years. There's some years you can just say, all right, let's just go to the next year because nothing really happened. In fact, you could say that was some centuries. But there are other centuries and other years like 1979 or 586 BCE or 539 BCE that you don't want to just jump over because they were pretty prominent and changed the world in a lot of ways. So I would like to tell you about the history of Jews in Iran. That's really what I want to focus on today. And obviously, it's in the news. Jews in Iran, or Israel in Iran, or Iranian proxies and Israel. But in order to understand why we are where we are right now, and that will also help you understand October 7th and the last couple of years, you really need to have a good background in, well, what is the relationship between Iran and Jews? Now, it was only in 1935 that Iran became Iran, and before that it was called Persia. Okay, now, you knew that, but did you know that the word Iran was changed to Iran from Persia because it sounded a lot like, in 1935, sounded a lot like Aryan.
Like what?
Aryan. Aryan. That it's the same root. And that the Nazis had a special racial dispensation for the Iranian people because they came from an Aryan background. In fact, they were the progenitors of the term Aryan. And it wasn't really, from the Iranian perspective, it wasn't because they were interested in Nazi racial policy, but they were interested in Nazi money buying their oil. And that was part of the reason why Persia changed its name to Iran. There are other reasons which we'll get into. And it has nothing, that is just sort of tangentially ironic how it affected the Jews. But at the time, the name changed from Persia to Iran to sound more like Aryan, had nothing to do with the Jews. It was mainly for political, regional, and economic influence, which is usually how most things are decided. Okay. Now, Janice, would you mind closing that? The glare comes right into it. Okay, so let's start off going all the way back in history to how the Jews got to Persia. Now, the Jews never did get to Persia. Persia conquered the Jews. Well, let's put it this way. The Jews didn't go to Persia. Persia came to the Jews. Sort of like the way Malcolm X said, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. All right? I don't know if he said that, but it's in the movie with Will Smith. Will Smith said that. Which, if you ever watched the TV show The Office, you remember The Office? Like Steve Carell's character was kind of a moron. And he once saw a picture of his friend. He was in a room with someone famous, and the guy had a picture with Nelson Mandela. And he went up to him and said, wow, how did you ever meet Morgan Freeman? So, okay. So I don't know if it's happened or not, but it was in the movie. The Jewish people come from Judea. And until, in the year 720, all right, actually, let me go back a little bit further. Historically, it's hard to date Moses. But it's probably somewhere between 1,300 and 1,600 years before zero. But what we do know is that by the time King David founded the city of Jerusalem, it was in the year 1000 BCE, and the archaeology is pretty clear on that. Even to the point where they found something that said, House of David, Beit David. It was actually a professor from my rabbinical school, Avraham Biran, who found it in an archaeological dig in a place called Tel Dan, which is in the Galilee. So, King David founds Jerusalem in 1000 BCE. In 723, the northern kingdom of Israel, called Israel, is conquered. And the only thing that survives is the southern kingdom called Judea. And the 10 tribes that lived in that northern kingdom disappear and become the 10 lost tribes. So there's 3 tribes left because one of the tribes split into 2, which is Joseph, split into Ephraim and Manasseh. So now, during the time of the second temple, during the time right before the first temple was destroyed, there are only 3 tribes left: Levi, Benjamin, and Judah. And they're living in the south, and Jerusalem's in the south, so they have the Holy Temple, and they're in the first Holy Temple, and everything's fine. But then the Babylonians in 586 BCE come down and destroy the first temple and take those Jews to Babylonia as slaves. And Babylonia today is Iraq. So now the Jews are in Babylonia when the first temple is destroyed. In 539, and watch what happens. 586, we're slaves in Babylonia. In 539, Persia conquers Babylonia, and Babylonia becomes Persia. We didn't come to Persia, Persia came to us. Does everyone see that? With me so far? Okay. So in 539 BCE begins the experience of Jews and Persia, which isn't going so well today. Okay, but where did it start? 2,500 years ago, and some change, maybe 2,500 years ago. Okay, now, there's so much history that I'm doing something that I never do for this class. I brought notes. Usually, but I'm not an expert in necessarily in Persian history, so I had to do a little bit of what you would call research. Okay. What happens to the Jews once they become slaves in Babylonia? Now, we might say, well, it was pretty much similar to when we were slaves in Egypt. And all we did was build houses all day and dig ditches and so forth. But the truth is, the Jews actually did pretty well. And they were able ultimately to assimilate into Babylonian society and then assimilate into Persian society. And one of the ways that we know that is because Jews take on some very serious positions, including becoming governor of the entire realm. And who was that? Someone you've probably heard of. His name was Daniel. There's a book in the Bible about Daniel. Well, who was Daniel? You ever hear the story about Daniel being thrown into the lion's den? There's a Grateful Dead song about it. I forget how it goes, but I know it exists. I'm trying to...
It's wonders and wonders, miracles.
Wait, there's Daniel in the lions. No, that's not it. All right, that's not the Grateful Dead version. Okay. Now, When Daniel, the king who destroyed the second temple, the king who destroyed the first temple, his name was Nebuchadnezzar. And he ruled for 45 years. And while he was ruling, ultimately Daniel ascends to this position. And the king liked him. But nobody else did. Because he was Jewish. Sounds a little bit like the Dreyfus affair. You know, someone reaches a high position, everyone else turns on him, frames him because he's Jewish, and they force him to, even against his will, throw Daniel into the lion's den, which they do, and they starve the lions so that they would be really hungry, so they'd really attack him, and nothing happens. So they bring Daniel out, and instead Nebuchadnezzar throws the people who accused Daniel of whatever they accused him, and they threw them into the lion's den, and before they even hit the ground, the lions totally devoured them. Okay, and so there became within Babylonia this idea that the Jews do have a God who watches out for them. And that there is, and these are polytheistic people. So they say, okay, but there is something unique about the Jews. You know, it was only, when did the Christians reject the Jews? It wasn't originally with Paul. In the beginning, Paul said, you know, I don't know what it is, but the Jews still have a relationship with God. But eventually, after Paul died, there became what you called replacement theology, where the Christians started to say under Augustine and some of the early church fathers that no, the Jews were God's chosen people, but now they're replaced by anyone who accepts Jesus. And if they don't accept Jesus, then they have no God. And if they have no God, you can persecute them. But in Babylonia, it wasn't. In fact, you need to persecute them to get them to the point. The purpose of the persecution, and not to kill them, was to persecute them to the point that they would accept Jesus. And some did, and most didn't, and so forth. Okay. Now, this is in 586, but by the time Nebuchadnezzar dies, we're going to jump ahead to his son, who has a weird name, and I'm not sure why this is his name, but his name was Evil Merodach. It's sort of like Evil Knievel. It doesn't mean he's a bad guy. It's just his first name. Now, Evil Merodach didn't hate the Jews. In fact, he lightened up on the Jews. And there was a very famous Jewish prisoner named Jehoiachin. Who was Jehoiachin? Jehoiachin was the king of Judea that Nebuchadnezzar conquered when he conquered Judea and threw him in jail. Well, 45 years later, Evil Merodach becomes king and he releases him from jail. Why is that important? Because Jehoiachin was a descendant of King David. And now when he was released, he was able to have kids who could be new descendants of King David. And if we didn't have new descendants of King David, we'd never have the Messiah, because the Messiah needs to be directly from King David. So you needed a miracle there to release Jehoiachin so that he could find a woman and have kids and so forth. And that's what gives us hope for the Messianic era, that King David's line continues. But he liked the Jews, and he was the king for 23 years. Okay. Then he had a son who wasn't so good, and his name was Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar, if you look in the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 29 of Jeremiah, verse 10, there is a prediction. Anyone know Jeremiah's famous prediction in Babylonia?
75 years.
Very close? 70 years. In 70 years, the Jews will... Boy, that's solid. That's good stuff. In 70 years, the Jews will go free. Jeremiah was alive at the time. He was a prophet, and he said, in 70 years, we're going to go free. There were two kings who miscalculated the 70 years. And what were they waiting for? They said, okay, Jeremiah was this famous prophet. The non-Jews respected him and said what he said is going to come true. So they waited the 70 years. And when the Jews were still not free, they said, great, now we can persecute the Jews. We don't have to worry. Jeremiah's prediction's nonsense. Well, they miscalculated. And the first one to miscalculate was Belshazzar. And right away, because he did that, he died. What did he do? He had a big party. And what did he do? He went and he did the same thing that Ahasuerus is going to do later. He goes and he finds all the stuff that the Babylonians had stolen from the Holy Temple, including the wine glasses and all this, and he started using them to drink wine with. Well, he died right after that. Right away he died. And that ushered in the collapse of the Babylonian Empire. That miscalculation ended the Babylonian Empire. At the same time, as the Babylonian Empire is coming to an end, Persia is rising. And who is the king of Persia at the time as Persia is rising? A guy named Darius the First. Darius the First, actually, he's the one with Daniel. And he appoints Daniel, and he's the one who puts him in the lion's den and so forth. I said it incorrectly before. I meant Darius the First. Daniel has now risen to this very high position. And Darius the First saves him. But Darius the First only ruled for 1 year. And there are some different stories about him in the books of Daniel and so forth. One famous story was 3 men named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Ever heard the story about these 3 guys? Okay, it's in the book of Daniel. And Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 3 Jews who were like court Jews. And they were well known. And they erected this big statue, and everyone was going to have to come and bow down to it. But it was a statue of the king. It wasn't the statue of a god. So they went to Ezekiel the prophet, who was alive, and they said, what should we do? He said, we're not bowing down to a god. It's just a statue of a person, so I guess it's not breaking the law. And Ezekiel said, don't show up. Just don't go. It's not going to be a good scene. It's not going to work out. They showed up anyway. And when the king said everyone has to bow down, they said, we're not doing it. We're proud Jews, and we don't bow down to anything. So they built this big fire, and they said, anyone who doesn't bow down, we're going to throw them in this fire. So they throw the 3 guys in the fire, and what happens to them? Nothing. Same thing that didn't happen to Abraham in the Midrash. They survive, and everyone says, wow, Judaism must be something. And it gained a lot of respect for Judaism. So my contention is, if you act as a proud Jew, you will do more to promote Judaism than if you cower and hide as a Jew in societies like ours. So be proud. Okay. Now, Darius dies within a year, even though he has the whole Daniel and the Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah story. But his son comes, and his son becomes probably the most famous Persian king of all time. Well, top 2 anyway. Who's this? Cyrus. Or in Hebrew, Koresh. Remember David Koresh from Waco? Koresh is Cyrus. That was the Hebrew of Cyrus. He didn't know which king he was. He didn't know if he was King David from Judea or if he was King Cyrus from Persia. So he said, David Koresh, I'm both. Also, they threw him in the fire. He wasn't unscathed. That was Janet Reno. I don't know what Reno means in Hebrew. But actually, I do. Okay, so Cyrus becomes the king for 3 years. And what does he do that's so famous? He tells the Jewish people, you can go back to Israel and rebuild your temple. Right? Because he really believed that as long as you're happy where you are, you'll pay your taxes. So if you want to build your temple, just pay your taxes, everything, because Judea was a vassal state to Persia. Persia ruled the whole area at the time. That's why we start off when we say in the Purim story that King Ahasuerus ruled 127 provinces, Mihodu ad Kush, right, from India to Ethiopia. The whole area was Persian. Okay. Anybody know what famous American president said, I am Cyrus? Nobody? So Cyrus is famous for letting the Jews go back to Israel. Harry Truman. Harry Truman, when he recognized the state of Israel in 1948, 13 minutes after it was declared, famously said, "I am Cyrus." Harry Truman knew his Bible. Yeah, Google it. Google. Okay, now, here's the problem with the Persians. Cyrus was great, but he died 3 years after he became king. And his son then became king. His son's name, as we know him in Hebrew, in English it's Xerxes, but in Hebrew we call him the brother of the Rosh. Now, who's the Rosh? Nebuchadnezzar. He was the brother-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. And brother-in-law in Hebrew is Achav. Achav Rosh. Achashverosh. Achashverosh. Xerxes is called in Hebrew Achashverosh because he was the brother of the Rosh, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the evil guy who destroyed the first temple, who didn't care for Jews, and his sister was Vashti. So Darius' son, Xerxes, married the Babylonian princess, Vashti. She hated Jews too. So they were a good couple. Achashverosh was a rabid anti-Jew hater, and so was Vashti, and they were a nice couple. And what Achashverosh did was he revoked Cyrus's edict that the Jews could continue building the temple. And he said, you can no longer build the temple. Now, why did he do that? Was it because he hated Jews? No, he didn't really care. But there were people living there, and they're not all good. Who were they? The Samaritans. Did you catch that? The good Samaritans? People living there, they're not. The Samaritans are people from Samaria. What's Samaria? The West Bank. Judea and Samaria. And they didn't want the Jews to build the temple because they wanted that area to be holy for their God. So they sent emissaries to Persia, and they convinced Achashverosh to stop building the temple, and they stopped building the temple. So in order to get that process started, you're going to need a miracle. And so what's the miracle? Esther. So Esther, the whole point of the story of Miriam is to get the process restarted of building the second temple. But Mordecai already, who sat by the gate, as the book of Esther explains it, was already a popular person and a well-known person in Persia. Now, who was Mordecai? Mordecai was a Jew from Judea. In fact, Mordecai is the first person in the Bible called a Jew. Mordecai ha-Yehudi. He's the first one that has the adjective Jew. Why? Because he was from Judea. How did he end up in Persia? He was one of the captives taken to Babylonia. But he did well. He got advanced in society and ended up becoming an important person. Clear so far? Okay. Pretty cool stuff, right? All right. So now the Purim story happens. Now, remember I told you Belshazzar was the first one who miscalculated the 70-year prophecy of Jeremiah, but there's one other king who does it, and that's Achashverosh. That's how the book of Esther starts. The book of Esther starts with a big party. By the way, this is why we drink and wear costumes on Purim. Because he was having this big costume party, and they were all drinking. Why were they having this big costume party and all drinking? Because they were celebrating that he thought the 70 years was up and he could now persecute the Jews, but he also miscalculated. So he was trying to count 70 years from the time that Nebuchadnezzar first started persecuting the Jews, but there was a king before him and a king after, and there were 2.5 years, and he counted those 2.5 years, and it was only 68 years and not 70, and 2 years later, the Esther story happens, and they do go free, and the 70-year prophecy does work out. But he was off by 2 years. Well, because he's off by 2 years, that sets something into motion. What happens at that party? He kills Vashti. There's no Purim story if Vashti isn't killed. Vashti's killed, you need a new queen. You need a new queen, you have a pageant, Esther gets elected, now you have a Purim story. If Vashti was never killed, Haman would have been able to convince Achashverosh to kill all the Jews, no problem. That would have been the end of the Jews right there.
Who killed Vashti?
Achashverosh had her killed because she wouldn't come out and dance in the nude in front of him and his friends, which is just rude. You know. So, okay. The Jews then remain, even though Achashverosh then changes his mind. By the way, Achashverosh and Esther have a son together. They get married. They have a son. His name is Darius II. And he helps the Jews continue to finish. He funds the building of the Second Temple. He's Jewish. His mom's Esther. And if you remember at the end of the story, Haman had all this money that he was going to use to pay Achashverosh to kill all the Jews. And Achashverosh says to Esther, all Haman's money is yours. What does Esther do? She gives it to her son. What does Darius II do with Haman's money? Builds a second temple. Right? That's in the Gemara. But the money actually changes hands in the Tanakh, in the book of Esther, which is pretty incredible. The rest of the story and how it plays out is in the Gemara. Yes?
Esther have another name?
Hadassah. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah. But Esther isn't really a name, it's a nickname, which means hidden. Lahastir. You say Hester Panim. Her true identity was hidden. Or really you could say God acting through her was hidden. By the way, think about this. There are a lot of lessons here for Jews living in the diaspora. Because at the time, they had already started building the second temple. And there are Jews living back in Judea now. And then Darius II lets them finish building the second temple. And the second temple now exists in Israel. But a lot of the Jews stay in Persia. Could you imagine today if the Holy Temple, if the Messianic era came, the Holy Temple was being built in Jerusalem and we said, we're good here. We're good here. Well, that's what happened. They said, even though you have the Holy Temple built, we like it here. We're treated with respect here. We make good livings here. We're comfortable here. We're staying here. And a lot of the Jews stayed there, which is very interesting. And it's kind of like what we have today. The difference then was they had prophets telling them, you might want to think about going back. And the Holy Temple was there. Today, we don't have the Holy Temple, obviously. Okay, so there's some interesting comparisons. And now, I don't have time to go through all of this. But you then have really starting from the time of Esther's 4th century. So 300s, somewhere in the 300s before the year 0. And from that period all the way to 600 is basically what you'd call then the late Persian period. Now what's so interesting about from the period of Esther up until 600 CE, and I could tell you all the different monarchies who lived at that time, and most of them were pretty good to the Jews, and the Jews did fine there, and that's why they didn't come back. But up until that point, from the time that Esther dies, again, that's 4th century, in the 300s before 0, all the way up until the time 600, there's no Islam. It doesn't exist yet. Muhammad hasn't been born yet. So there's no Islam. So the Jews are doing just fine because there's no Islam. But comes the late Persian period. And all of a sudden, by the 650s, the Muslims have conquered the Iranian area, that region, Persian area. And now, the Jews went from being, just kind of citizens like everybody else. We have a God, you have a God, they have a God. There's one God and you don't have it. Right. So Jews become dhimmi. You know what dhimmi is? D-H-I-M-M-I. We become second-class citizens. We have to pay extra taxes. Our presence is restricted. Our synagogues have to be really low. Lots of different things become outlawed. But for the most part, unlike in Christian areas, in Christendom, the Jews were protected. You had to be second-class citizens. So did the Christians. So did anyone else. But you weren't slaughtered. You weren't burned at the stake. And if you look back at the Jewish experience from 1947, going all the way back to 586 BCE, there's a good 2,500 years of Jewish experience in Iran, in present-day Iran and Iraq, where the Jews existed pretty well. Okay, they got used to being second-class citizens, but people left them alone, and they lived in their own areas, and they made a living, and okay. Now, there were some rough periods, but for the most part, the Jews of Persia did pretty well. And they had a pretty prolific community until the 1800s. Okay, so what happened in the 1800s? In 1839, a lot of the Jews lived in a city called Mashhad. I don't remember exactly where in Iran it is, but Mashhad, Mashhad. And one of the blood libels that existed in the Christian world somehow made it into the Muslim world. And there became this rumor in 1839 that the Jews were slaughtering, non-Jewish babies, to make their matzahs and so forth. Me personally, I don't like a bloody matzah. I know some of you do. We've been doing it for centuries, killing Christian babies in the backyard so that we can make our matzahs. But this horrific blood libel, of which hundreds of thousands of Jews have been slaughtered over the ages, made its way to Mashhad. And there was a pogrom. And not we think of pogroms, it wasn't enormous, but dozens of Jews were murdered. Ian, you get a lot of calls. So this became known as the Al-Adad, Allahdad. The Jews gave it that name, and it has something to do with like the outburst of hatred. I don't remember exactly how it translates, but it was called the Al-Adad, and it sort of ended this, long-standing golden age of this major Jewish community called Mashhad, and that's when a lot of the Jews ended up moving to more cosmopolitan areas, mainly Tehran. And that's where the Jewish community ended up from, like 1840s all the way for about another 100 years. Well, 130 years or so. Okay. So now, in a post-1839 world, the Jews in Persia did pretty well. They weren't, other than that one incident, they came to Tehran and they did pretty well, and they were not despised. They had to pay some extra taxes and do something, but they assimilated into society. And 1840s, this is the time that Zionism is really, the first wave of Aliyah is beginning, and over the next 30 to 40 years, Zionism is really going to be developing, and they were not Zionist. And one of the most unbelievable, bizarre circumstances is, if you go to Israel today, and you just sat at a cafe, and you watch Jews walk by, and you look at them and you say, where do you think this guy's from? Where do you think this guy's from? Where do you think this guy's from? Most of them look Middle Eastern. There's been so much intermarriage between Ashkenazim and Sephardim that the majority of Israelis today are not Caucasian. Right? They're more Middle Eastern looking. More than 50.1% of Israelis are not Caucasian. Now that's no surprise. A million Sephardic Jews came from the Middle East after 1948. Within the next 10 years. But there's so much. In the early days, Ashkenazim wouldn't marry Sephardim. We're elite. We're from Germany, where they love us so much. But there was this feeling of the Ashkenazic Jews that they were intellectually and culturally superior to the Sephardim. I mean, that doesn't exist anymore, but in the early days it did. But by today, there's so much intermarriage that you can't tell. And if you would stop any Israeli on the street and ask, where's your family from? It's going to be Morocco, Iraq, Libya. I mean, occasionally you'll get France, whatever. And there's certain areas. You also get Ethiopia and Russia. But there's a lot of Morocco, a lot of Iraq, a lot of Syria, all these places, the Yemen, wherever the Jews were living. None of them were really Zionist. Why? Because they were pretty happy where they were. And what happened was, because the Zionists, who primarily were coming from Europe, were moving to Palestine, those Arab nations who didn't want a Jewish presence in Palestine began taking it out on their own Jews who weren't even Zionists, didn't even want to go to Israel, but ended up then going to Israel because you persecuted us for what they did that we didn't want to do. Now you're making us do what you don't want them to do. This is the logic of anti-Semitism in a nutshell. There's no way you can make anti-Semitism make sense. So I'm online a lot. You probably know I'm a huge celebrity between here and Roasters and Joanna's. So a lot of times I'll get anti-Semites who respond to my things. And there are a few common tropes. One of them is, you Jews have been kicked out of 109 countries. There must be something wrong with you. I said, yeah, there's two things wrong with us, Christianity and Islam. Because those 109 countries were Christianity and Islam, and they were bigoted. And you, who just wrote to me, are doing a wonderful job continuing that bigotry. Shkoyach. Yeah. And they're like, oh yeah, that's why you were kicked out. Yeah, because your ancestors are bigots. But you are doing a great job keeping their tradition alive. So, L'dor Vador Yasher Koach. Okay, so comes 19... I want to tell you the exact year, because where did I write this? 1925. So let's skip ahead from, because really from 1839, after the Al-Adad, when the Jews are primarily now living in Tehran, the Jews were considered second class, no question. And there were periods of time where they if you know about the Marranos in Spain, that happened in parts of Iran too. There were places where there were secret Jews, where they had to do all kinds of things to hide their Judaism, where they would buy meat, non-kosher meat, take it home and feed it to their dogs, and then slaughter kosher animals on their own. They had to do things like that. They always married their kids off as soon as they were married, as soon as they were born. There were arranged marriages from the time they're 3, 4, 5 years old to another Jewish family for the purpose of preventing intermarriage. Because in secret, they were not Jews. And so they created arranged marriages so that nobody would then go out. And if anyone ever asked, well, how see you always seem to marry? Oh, it was arranged. That's, But that's how they got around intermarriage. Because they were living not as, in public, they were living not as Jews. So, and there are a variety of different things. You hear the same kinds of stories with the Marranos in Spain and Portugal. People leaving the Inquisition. But in 1925, a new power comes to Iran. A new person takes over Iran, and his name is Reza Shah Pahlavi. These guys were not Islamists. And they basically emancipated the Jews completely. The Shahs had no problem with the Jews. Now, we always think of the Shahs and their long dynasty. You know how many Shahs there were? 2. There was one Shah and then his son. There was Reza Shah Pahlavi and his son, Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. Those are the only 2. One guy ruled from 1920, Reza, the first one, ruled from 1925 to 1941. The other one ruled from 1941 to 1979. You know what happened in 1979. Now he's got, I guess, a son who lives in Detroit or something, or who knows where he is. Hopefully soon he'll be the new ruler of Iran. Yeah. How did they come to power? Not exactly sure. But it had a lot to do with economic and social welfare. And what really was going on at the time was who controlled the oil fields. Because what just happened? World War I. And there was Iran was very rapidly, still Persia until 1935, but was very rapidly becoming industrialized because of its oil. And the only question was who are they going to be in bed with? And there were really two choices. On one side, the main powers were Great Britain and Russia, who were interested in their oil, and on the other hand, it was Germany. And they ended up going with Germany. And so they became, which is ironic, because the Shah was very, again, I'm no Iranian scholar, so I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to do better research to figure out exactly how they rose, but somehow they rose. They had no problems with Jews. But while they had no problems with the Jews, they're doing business with the Nazis. Because Germany was their main client for their oil. And the Nazis never really came to that area, so they didn't force them, and they didn't force their racial, theories. So the Jews actually did pretty well. Well, they did really well during that time, the ones in Iran, and they were pretty much untouched by the Holocaust. So they didn't have a huge reason to be joining any Zionist movement. Why would we want to go drain swamps in Palestine and be surrounded by enemies? The Shah treats us very well right here. And really, the Shah removed because he was not an Islamist, and because he wanted to get away from those taxes and all that stuff, that elevated the Jews and it elevated them in society, and they ended up doing really well. They became very much integrated in society. And when his son took over in 1941, all the way through 1979, the Jews became pretty elevated in society. Even more so by 1948, because Iran became the second Muslim state after Turkey to recognize Israel, and Iran and Israel had very good relationships until 1979. In fact, there was a daily flight from weekly flight from Ben Gurion to Tehran. Could you imagine? A weekly flight every day. There was a lot of business going on back and forth between Iran and Israel. There was a full diplomatic team in Iran, and they were going back and forth. Now, why would that be so? 3 reasons. 1, Iran does not share a border with Israel, which means it never really went to war with Israel. 1948, 1967, 1973, Iran not really a factor. 2, Iranians are not Arab, right? They're Persian. It's different. And so they don't have the same kinship with the other Arab nations. And 3, most importantly, they're Shiite. And all of Israel's surrounding enemies, primarily, at the time, were Sunni. And so they didn't have the same bones to pick with Israel that primarily the rest of the Arab world did. The overwhelming majority of the Arab world is Sunni. The Shiites are a huge minority. In fact, there are hardly any Shiites anywhere outside of Iran and Iraq. Almost all of them are there. Arabs almost everywhere else, Muslims almost everywhere else are Sunni. Arabs can be Christians, Arab could be whatever. But Muslims are almost entirely Sunni. And it's only really in Iran and Iraq that you have huge swaths of Shiites. So they didn't have this natural fight with Israel up until 1979. Now, obviously, 1979, everything changes. So we have to ask the question, when Ayatollah Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution take over in 1979, why was it that they hated Israel so much? I mean, why is it that their main focus, there are other Islamist regimes, but look what Iran's done. Iran is maybe, it's up to President Trump right now, but they've maybe given up their regime simply because of how much they hate Israel. I mean, if it wasn't for October 7th and Iranian backing of this, if it wasn't for their building the nuclear bombs and all the things that they're doing now and oppressing their own people, they wouldn't be in danger of America coming in and taking out their regime, or Israel coming in and taking out their regime. But even still, even after Trump bombed their nuclear reactors, they're trying to rebuild them. They're using China to help restart their ballistic missile program. Why? Because they hate Israel so much. Why in 1979 did they develop this hatred, this tremendous hatred of Israel and, of course, America? And by the way, the nicknames, Trump wasn't the first one to come up with nicknames. The Ayatollah. Now, I will tell you this. This is deep movie trivia. I don't think any of you will get this. But what movie character had the nickname the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla? You'll never get it. The Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla. Apollo Creed from Rocky IV. When he was announced, you know the scene where he's fighting Drago in Las Vegas, you know, James Brown singing. They have a whole... I can't remember how Pahlavi came to power, but I remember that he was called the Ayatollah of Rock and Roll. So I was thinking of Purim. I was going to dress up as any biblical character. Because dressing up as any male biblical character will make you automatically look like Ayatollah Khomeini. So I could dress, but then have like an Elvis suit. And I would be the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla. That's going to be my Purim costume. So, yeah, it's not bad. It's not bad. Can you imagine? So, what are you? I'm the Ayatollah of Rock and Rolla. Had you not taken this class, that would seem pretty unbelievable. Okay. But every rabbi has like an Abraham costume, where you have like a big dress thing and a belt and a staff and a white beard, which could literally be any character from the Tanakh, any male character from the Tanakh. So, and if you get the hat, you could be the Ayatollah. Okay, so, one, Iran hates the West. All right, they hate Western values, and so the nickname that he had, the Ayatollah for America, we know is the Great Satan, but that makes Israel the Little Satan. So we're really just a representative, of Western values that Khomeini and his people and the Islamic Revolution hated. Now, why did they hate it so much? Because the Shahs embraced it so much. And here they are, the Ayatollah Khomeini, walking around his whole life, seeing women in bikinis. And seeing movies that are, inappropriate. And seeing all this stuff and saying, look how the Shahs have brought America to Iran. We need to get rid of that. We hate that. And because of that, we hate America. And because of that, we hate America's representative in our neighborhood, Israel.
I'm a little confused with the Sunni and the Shiites. So you say the Sunnis hate Israel and the Jews?
Everyone hates Israel and the Jews. So the Sunnis, let's say it this way. The Iranians were not big players in the 1948 war, the 1967 war, and the 1973 war. Main reason? They didn't share a border with Israel. But second main reason is they weren't as invested in an Arab problem because they don't see themselves as Arabs. And they're not as invested in a Sunni problem because they don't see themselves as Sunnis, because they're Shiites. So, do they hate Jews? Of course. Are they as invested in what's going on in Palestine? Not as much. Why? Because they're really far away. Whereas Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, and Egypt, they're right there. So, now, did they contribute some troops? Sure. But did they send their whole army? No. And because they didn't send their whole army, they didn't lose. The Egyptians are still not over any of those wars. But the Iranians weren't part of those wars. I mean, they sent a couple brigades, but not like the other nations. Okay, so Israel represented for Iran Western values, but also Western imperialism. You don't belong in this part of the world. And you Jews who are bringing Europe to the Middle East, you don't belong here. So they hated it. Now, meanwhile, it's the Jews who are coming home. It's actually, Israel's the most classic case of decolonization in human history, but that's not how they saw it. Okay? The facts should never get in the way. Okay. Now, when Iran took over in 1979, all of the powers who automatically supported them now hated them. The West. The Shah's allies were the West. Well, the Islamic Revolution comes up and America, Great Britain, or say, Iran, you used to be our friend. We don't want any part of you now. You hate us. We can't do business with you. By the way, remember the hostages? Wasn't great for American relations or relations with the West. That was it. So the Shah says, Khomeini comes in and says, we just lost all our allies. And the Sunnis don't like us either. But there's one thing we have, you have to understand this. There's one thing we have in common with the Sunnis. More than we hate each other, we hate Jews. And that in and of itself became one of the main ways that Iran started making friends. You want us to help you destroy Israel? No problem. Because when the Iranians went to Jordan and Egypt and Lebanon and Yemen and Libya and Syria, and said, what do you need most? We need to destroy Israel. No problem. Now, the Iranians also, for all the reasons they hated America, they hated Israel. One of the main reasons that they hated America, besides that America was no longer their friend after Khomeini took over, was that in the Iran-Iraq war, America backed Iraq. Because it was the lesser of two evils in the mind of American strategists. And the Iranians never forgave them for that, and they never forgave Israel for that. Israel had nothing to do with it. But the determination in Washington was Iraq is less of a danger to the region and to us than Iran is. And they actually backed Iraq. And there were meetings of people like Rumsfeld and stuff meeting with Saddam Hussein. Later on, those meetings would take on a much different turn, if you remember that. So I pointed out 3 reasons so far. 1, Western values. 2, they hated imperialism. And 3, regional politics. They needed to make some friends. And a great way to make friends is to attack Israel. Now, number 4, the 4th reason, you have to understand how much the Iranian regime hates women. They hate women. They have no use for women's rights. And the only place that really was representing women's rights was Israel. Israel had already had a female prime minister by this point. And women had rights. And they did not want that to inspire their women to think that they had rights, or that they could take off their hijabs, that they could drive cars and stuff like that. And so the fact that they took women's rights and the persecution of women so seriously was another reason that they hated Israel. It was a big one. I mean, it's not easy for us to understand how insane these people were. But they almost look at women the way Nazis look at, people they persecuted. We have to do everything we can to subjugate these people. I guess they still need them to make new people, but Nazis had no use for Jews. But anyway. And then finally, and really sort of the most random one, there's something called, I don't even know how to say this, Mahdi, which is like a messianic concept. And there was this idea in Islam. Now, look, I'm no Muslim scholar. I don't understand this really at all. I just read a little bit about it. But there's this idea that the messianic era for them can come about when the oppressors redeem the oppressed, or when the oppressed are redeemed from the oppressors. And Iran had done everything it could to paint Israel and America as the great oppressors. And if we could defeat them, then we could bring about a messianic era. And the Iranians have been trying all these years to convince their people that destroying Israel is the goal of, bringing about a better world. They have not convinced their own people. Most of their own people do not believe that. Most of their own people are exhausted and sick of the fight against Israel, that instead of having schools and programs and roads and infrastructure and an economy that actually functions, they have ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons that were just bombed. But these are the main reasons why from 1979 until today, Iran has hated Israel so much. And in their pursuit of hating Israel, their policy was, we're not strong enough as a nation to defeat Israel. We know we can't defeat Israel. Israel is a better and stronger army than us, and the United States is arming them, and the United States is stronger than anyone who's going to help us. And what we found out in the last war was, when we did go toe-to-toe with Israel, America and the West did support Israel, and the people we thought would support us, Iran, China and Russia, called us up and said, you guys might want to end this war because it's not looking so good for you, and we're not coming to help you. Because China and Russia have no interest in radical Islam in their territory either. And they said, we're not starting World War III over Israel. We don't even care. That's not even our issue. So we're not doing that. And that was a shock to their system. And now they're reeling to the point where their own people think that maybe they can overthrow the regime. But the regime, which has been morally bankrupt since 1979, is now on the verge of being financially bankrupt to the same extent, because they spent all of their money on this alternate strategy of destroying Israel, which is not to defeat them one-on-one in a war, but to surround them with proxies. And so they surrounded them with Hamas in the south, and Hezbollah in the north, and militias in Syria, and militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen. And the goal was and this is what Israel's been afraid of for the last 20 years, is if there was a war with Iran, Hezbollah would rain down hundreds of thousands of ballistic missiles on Israel, and Israel would be destroyed, even to the point that Netanyahu thought at the beginning of the war, we could win the war, but we'll lose most of our infrastructure, and we'll lose the Tel Aviv skyline. And the Israelis are pleasantly shocked that they were able to defeat Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, get rid of Assad in Syria, and beat down Iran with very minimal damage. There's damage. A lot of people died, but not nearly what they expected. So the Iran of 1979 had been waiting for October 7th. And everyone in Israel, every time I've been going to Israel for the last 20 years, kept saying it's not a matter of if, it's when. And on October 7th, probably Hamas got a little itchy and maybe jumped the gun a little bit. And had they coordinated it better with Hezbollah, Israel might have lost, or lost a lot more. But October 7th for Iran was a complete and utter failure. October 7th was a disaster for Israel. But in the wake of it, although it's been a diplomatic disaster, it's been a military victory. And the biggest loser has been Iran. So in a nutshell, that's 2,500 years of Iranian history with the Jews. No. Okay. No. Okay. So, okay. Questions, comments, whatever.
So what do you hear from those Israeli, living in Israel? What do you hear? Are they going to continue? Are they going to use their position that they are now in, which is Israel is very strong now? Repeat the question. Are they going to go after Iran?
Oh, is Israel going to go after Iran? Here's the moral state of the world. This is the moral state of the world in a nutshell. So she says, well, what's going to happen now? What's Israel going to do with Iran? The moral state of the world is Iran has been solely dedicated to destroying America and Israel since the beginning of the regime. And now that it's people who've been taught and brainwashed since 1979 that Israel is the little Satan and America is the big Satan, those people who've been brainwashed that whole time now want to overthrow the regime that taught them that. And the only people they're reaching out to help, because the only people they know that would even consider helping them, are the great Satan and the little Satan. All of their money is banked on America and Israel saving them, because they know there's not one Arab country that would lift a finger to do a thing for any of them. That's the moral state of the world right now. Which is unbelievable. So what's going to happen? Well, Bibi's in D.C. right now. He's on his way. He's meeting with Trump in the next day or two. And Israel has said that if America doesn't attack Iran, they might. Now, why would they? Really, one reason. Because China's helping Iran to rebuild its ballistic missile program. And, one of the things you saw in the war was an intelligence slaughter. Israel ran circles, the Mossad ran circles around the Iranians. I mean, we found out that the people running most of the Iranian intelligence programs worked for Mossad. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. We don't know that Khomeini isn't working. No, I don't know. He's not. But, I mean, the Mossad has just run circles around them to the point where the Mossad has bases inside of Tehran. And it's really unbelievable. So if there is another war, Israel will slaughter them again. But Iran's not up for it. Their own people are out against them. Now, we'll see what Trump does. It's hard to say. Lindsey Graham came out to say today, I just read a headline before I came in here, said that Trump said that help is on his way and he's a man of his word. So, I mean, listen, you scoff at that, but he did bomb the nuclear reactors. Now, I'm not saying he's a good guy, but he went into Venezuela, he bombed Iran. There's no reason to think he wouldn't be willing to knock out the regime. I think the reason they haven't so far is because of Iraq. You take out Saddam Hussein and you figure you've cured Iraq. You've actually made it a lot worse. We got ISIS. And now Iran controls Iraq. And now the whole thing is a mess. So great, you take out the Ayatollahs. Who takes over? Most people think that the IRGC will be the only ones who will be able to take over. They're more radical than the government. So you could take out the Ayatollah. That's easy. But what do you replace it with? And so I don't think Israel or America necessarily, at the time that they bombed Iran the first time, neither of them had a good answer to that. Now, do I know what they've been working on since? Yeah, but I can't say it. I can't say it here. Yeah. No, I have no idea. We'll have to see what happens. He is, but the IRGC might kill him the day he lands. Who knows? I don't know who's gonna. I think it's easy to go kill the Ayatollah for America, but I think figuring out what's gonna happen to Iran after is a lot more confusing, and that's what they're working on right now. I hope. Yes.
So I have a question. What you said about that the Mossad has really run circles around the intelligence. So could you address that, juxtapose what happened on October 7th? That all of the talk was that they didn't listen to their own, the women at the border, they didn't listen to their own intelligence. And that's one of the reasons that Hamas was able to get in.
Well, yeah, sure. So you're looking at two different assumptions. One assumption was that someday we're going to go to war with Iran and they're going to fire infinite ballistic missiles against us. So we need to be planted in Tehran, ready to knock out their launchers before they launch. That was one assumption that was right. The other assumption was that when Israel is attacked, it'll be from Hezbollah or the West Bank, but not from the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip doesn't have the Hamas doesn't have the capability that Hezbollah has. That was a wrong assumption. So they got one right and one wrong. October 7th was a complete and total intelligence failure.
They also thought they placated Hamas with all the money that was going in there.
Yeah, I mean, everything about Gaza was miscalculated.
They also relied on electronics instead of human.
Well, actually, those tatzpataniot, the women were telling them, we see, but they didn't listen.
They're so comfortable with what they do.
Yeah, and they didn't listen to the intelligence. Now listen, if you're Netanyahu, you get an intelligence report every day that someone's coming to destroy us, every single day. You got to figure out which ones are right and which ones is wrong. October 7th was a complete and total failure. I mean, and if you what's amazing about it is, Israel put in safeguards after the Yom Kippur War that could never happen again. And if you talk to anyone, I have talked to retired people from the Mossad. One of them's a professor at UM, Chaim Shaked. He used to be in the Mossad. I had lunch with him not long after October 7th, and he said, he's been a professor for many years at UM, but he formerly was in the Mossad. He said, I was in the Mossad after the Yom Kippur War. We put in all these safeguards that if anyone would come across our border, we'd be ready. For the life of me, I can't figure out how those safeguards weren't there. I mean, I cannot imagine. And I've heard multiple retired Mossad people say things like that. So how it happened, I have no idea. But obviously a lot of things were miscalculated.
You think it's because they were women?
That they didn't listen to them? No. The Israeli army could not function without women. Women. No,
But do you think in this?
no. Israeli women are part of every single facet of the army. They're relied on in the most important positions.
So why do you think they didn't listen to them?
They didn't listen to a lot of people.
I
not
don't-
just one part.
Yeah, I don't know. But they paid for it. And a lot of those women died because of it. So, or were taken hostage. So,
Getting back to the Jews that were in Persia,
yeah.
I guess a lot of them, the Jews left in '79. They all went to Beverly Hills.
Yeah.
And the synagogue, because they have a huge
They all, I mean,
Persian.
when Khomeini took over, the Jews were allowed to leave. Most went to Israel, but a lot came to the States. So, and Europe, somewhat. Rich?
I believe you commented that Iran was the big loser, the October 7th war. If you had a friend or relative that was killed in that war, would you think they feel that way?
I did have a friend who was killed.
And do you feel that way?
Well, look, you could say that about any war. We
You
won.
specifically said,
Well, I feel like we won World War II, but how many Americans lost their lives? I mean, America's won wars before. People always die in war. So I did know people who died on October 7th, and it's horrific. I mean, Israel paid a price that it will never recover from. You will never recover from this price. There are things you don't recover from. You don't recover from the Holocaust. You don't recover from Yom Kippur. You don't recover from October 7th. All of my family that live in Israel have PTSD. They hear something and a loud noise and they shake. I have PTSD sometimes just for seeing, but the numbers that were expected in a war with Iran and Hezbollah and Israel were in the hundreds of thousands.